So, for us to understand the story better, we need to start from verses 1 to 3. The context. The Pharisees and the scribes have a complaint about Jesus, right? From verses 1 and 2, Pharisees and the scribes have a complaint against Jesus. And they say, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And then Jesus goes on to tell 3 stories in Luke chapter 15. Right? And this is his response to their complaint. Jesus desires to show these religious leaders the true picture of God through these 3 stories. But we have to understand, the Pharisees and the scribes were devoted lay leaders. They were the deacons, elders, Sunday school teachers, and committee chairs. These men were completely devoted to the law, and their lives were wholly devoted to keeping the law. Before we quickly dismiss them, we need to recognize that they had the right intentions, but their execution was all wrong. They thought only way to a relationship with God is through the law. But you see, holiness does not come from keeping a set of rules, but it comes from having a relationship with the Holy One, Jesus Christ. And that relationship with Jesus Christ cannot be initiated or sustained by keeping a set of rules, no matter how extensive those rules may be. So these religious leaders believed that they were the protectors of God's law. Hence, they believed themselves to be protectors of God's reputation. So they had a problem with Jesus because Jesus was a rabbi of God, yet he hung out with sinners and tax collectors. He not only hung out with them, but he ate with them. In their culture, eating with somebody meant that you have received them as your own. So at issue was the character of the holy God. The scribes and Pharisees, these religious leaders, the issue was, how can you hang out with these scumbags when you call yourself a rabbi of God? Jesus, knowing their complaint, he responds by telling 3 stories that are in our passage. A shepherd goes after a lost sheep. A woman looks everywhere for her lost coin. And the father comes towards the lost sons. They're not just one son that's lost, there are 2 sons. So all 3 stories work together to reveal to us the heart of God for the lost. They're like sets. You guys like sets? They're like episodes, right? Like one story, 2 stories. You can't study one story without other 2. They all work together to reveal God's heart for the lost. So this story isn't just about the younger son, because he gets all the airtime, right? But actually, there are 2 sons, and they're both lost. The younger son isn't the only one that breaks the father's heart. The older son also manages to break the father's heart, yet Father loves them both. So the main character of the story isn't the younger son, nor is it the older son, but it's the father. And main theme of the story is God's lavish love shown through the father's love for both sons. So let's look at father's response to the younger son first, and we'll look at the older son next. So verse 12, the younger son asks for his father for his part of the inheritance. But in their culture and in most cultures, sons received their inheritance when the father was what? When the father was dead. When the father was dead. So what the younger son is really saying is this: Father, I wish you were dead so I could have my money. Dr. Bailey points out that such a request is unheard of in that culture. He tested this in endless villages throughout the Middle East. He asked, has anyone ever made such a request in your village? And the answer is always no. He then asked, if anyone did make such a request, what would happen? The answer is always his father would beat him. Of course. Why? Because the request means he wants his father to be dead. He wants his father to die. Here's what we learn about the basic nature of sin. Sin is not breaking rules, although that is involved. It is breaking a relationship. At the beginning of the story, the younger son has not broken any rules, but he has broken his father's heart. The older son keeps all the rules. We're going to see he's going to keep all the rules, do all the things right, yet he also manages to break the father's heart. Verse 12, the father does not beat him. He does not kick him out, but rather he does what is asked. He sells all that he had owned so that he can fulfill what was asked of him. And everyone that's hearing this story cannot believe what's happening. The father should beat him and kick him out of the house and cut him off, for that is the only appropriate response. But this father is different. And you see, in the Middle Eastern culture, a man's wealth was closely tied to how much he was revered. So the more you had, the better you were treated. Here the father allows his name to be tarnished in order to grant the younger son's wish. He had to sell everything in order to give what the younger son had wanted. Verses 13 and 14, the younger son, as soon as he gets his money, not too long after, he takes off. He spends all of the money on reckless living, wild, expensive living. To make the matters worse, there's a severe famine in the faraway country, in the whole country. Verses 15 and 16, yet he does not go home. Why doesn't he go home? See, in their culture, in the Middle Eastern culture at the time, punishing a child was done corporately. It wasn't just his father that he needed to face. It was all of the elders of the village. He knows when he does return, the elders of the village, everyone had right to shame him and hurt him and punish him for leaving town and wasting all of his father's money. He also knows that his older brother will never let him return unless he could pay back the money that he has spent. And this is why the Pharisees and the scribes always demanded payment for one's sin. Before you can come in, you have to measure up. This is why the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious leaders, complained to Jesus, "Why do you hang out with these scumbags?" So this younger son knows he can't go back home, so he gets a job at a pig farm. Pig farming is still one of the most difficult work today, one of the dirtiest jobs today. I looked it up. But for a Jewish man to feed pigs, there was nothing worse. To Jews, pigs are unclean. For you to feed pigs, for a Jewish man to feed pigs, there's nothing worse. But he is too desperate that he is willing to steal food from the pigs. And no one gave him anything. As he's starving and trying to fight pigs for food. Have you ever fought pigs for food? That's not a battle you're going to win. As he's fighting pigs for food, verse 17 says, he comes to himself. Things finally became clear to him. What became clear? What allows him to actually think about going back home? He realizes how generous and loving his father has been all these years. It's the memory of the father that allows him to even think about going back. He was afraid of all the scorn and all the punishment, all the shame he's going to face from the village elders. So he couldn't go back. But as he was starving there, fighting pigs for food, it's the memory of the father. How generous and good he is allows him to even think about going back home. And verse 17, he says, how many of my father's workers, higher men have more than enough bread, but I'm about to die here hungry. Again, it's the generosity and the goodness of his father that calls him back home. And this is why you and I need to preach the gospel and remind people that we have a gracious God. See, most people in Itaewon will not come to Jesus out of fear for hell. Believe in Jesus or go to hell. That's one of the main messages of street evangelists, right? Believe in Jesus or go to hell. But remember, it's the grace, goodness, and the generosity of God that will cause a sinner to return to him. That's why Romans 2, Paul says, Romans 2:4, it's God's kindness that is meant to lead us to repentance. We have to remember that. As we love people, as we walk with people, as we live life with non-believers, we really need to remember it's the generosity of God. Verse 18 and 19, so the son decides to return with a plan. I mean, he realizes, okay, I can't do this. I can't fight pigs for food. And I realize how generous my father is. But he realizes what he's done, and he says, okay, I'm going to have to come up with a plan. I'm going to come up with a speech. And he nervously prepares his speech and practices it over and over again because he knows he's in trouble. He knows he has to have that talk with his father. You know, when I was growing up, my dad was a church planter himself. I was growing up in middle of nowhere, one street light, somewhere in Gangwon-do. I don't know if you guys know Gangwon-do. That's where you guys go do vacation. You guys don't go live there. One street light. It was a PK. So there was service all day going on. So me and my friends, we didn't have iPads. We didn't have phones. We didn't have much of anything. So we would always play together. We would always get in trouble together. It was a very dry summer day. And we're just messing with matches. We found some matches, just messing with matches, burning little things around the house, helping our parents get rid of some trash. You know, that's what we're doing. And then we got bored, right, lighting these little things on fire. So in the corner of my eye, as we were lighting things up, I saw our empty doghouse. Right? We didn't have a dog. I was like, okay, I'm going to help my parents get rid of this doghouse. I'm going to burn it down. It's going to be fun. So this is around like 3 o'clock afternoon. I was like 9 or 10, right? So me and my buddies, we're like, we're not going to burn the whole thing down. We're going to get in trouble, right? So we're going to just try to burn part of it, right? And we do that. Wind picks up. It's a very dry summer. So the wind pick up, and very soon the whole house is on fire, along with our house, which is right next to the doghouse. So at that point, I was like, okay, I could either run and not come back home, become an orphan, or I could run into the afternoon service, right? Korean church, they have like 2 services. I don't know why. One is not enough. So I'm like, okay, I got to tell my dad. So I walk in. It's like church of maybe 60, 70 people. I run in. I still remember my dad's preaching. I run in the middle of, there was a divide. I run in the middle. I said, Dad, the house is on fire. In the middle of his preaching. You know, my dad prepared like 20 hours to preach his sermon, right? So I'm in trouble. So everyone gets out. All the elders, all deacons, service is over, and everyone lines up, puts the fire out, and my mom's like, dude, you're in trouble. I'm like, Mom, I know. My mom's like, no, you're in trouble. So Mom's like, Dad, he doesn't want to talk to you right now. He's really upset. He's going to talk to you tomorrow. So in my room, I'm thinking about the speech, nervously thinking about the speech. When my dad was gracious, he was very, very gospel-centered, so that was good. But I could imagine how nervous this son is at this point, thinking about what to say to his dad. So verses 18 to 19. So the son, right, he comes up with the speech, and he has a 3-part speech. Verses 18 and 19. This is really important. Part 1, I have sinned against you and heaven. He repents. Part 2, I am no longer worthy to be your son. Result of his sin. He understands. Part 3, make me like one of your higher men. The plan to pay the debt, right? 3-part speech. Verse 20, while he was still, remember that 3-part speech. Verse 20, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. You see the love of the Father here. He waits for a son that wanted him dead. He runs to him. Back in the days, no man of his status ever ran. Running was a shameful thing. But again, he runs. Running was for only servants and kids, but he runs. Why does he run? That's a good question. Why does he run? One, he runs because he's glad to see his son alive. I think we've heard that before. But two, here's another reason, more important reason. The father runs because he knows what the son will face when he gets to the village gates. The father knows that the son will face humiliation, and the elders of the village may come and beat him and bringing great shame to him. So the father runs, bringing shame unto himself, so that his son can be spared of his shame. And hearing this, imagine the Pharisees and the scribes, these religious leaders would have been shocked by the image of God that Jesus is drawing. And they're thinking the father should have disowned the son who wanted him dead. The father should have remained distant at the sight of his son who squandered his money, who shamed the father's name, who shamed the family. But Jesus knows a different kind of a father. Jesus knows a different kind of father. Jesus, the one who knows the Father best. No one else knows the Father better than Jesus, who spent eternity with Jesus, opens our eyes and says, this is the type of Father that we have. This is the type of God that we have. And he says this Father runs. This Father kisses him. This Father is filled with compassion. This Father embraces his son who is covered in filth and shame. That's the type of father that Jesus is inviting us to see through Luke 15. So the son tries to present his speech, his three-part speech. Verse 21, look with me. So the son says to the father, Father, I have sinned before you and heaven, right? Part 1, he recognizes his sin and repents. Part 2, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He recognizes the consequences of his sin. But before he can say more, part 3, what was part 3? His plans to pay his father back, the father interrupts him. You see that? Before he could say, Father, hire me as one of your hired men, Father interrupts him, and he says what? He says, hey, servant, bring all these things. You see, this is the gospel. God will not demand a payment because Jesus made that payment for us. Jesus died the death that you and I should have died. He took our place on that cross. He was rejected. We were received. He was despised. We were delivered. And on that day of his death, he took all of our sins and put on us his righteousness. Therefore, there is nothing for us to pay back. On that resurrection Sunday, he overcame sin and death once for all, so we can live in that resurrection reality. That's why Father interrupts him. So verse 22, the father tells his servant to bring the best robe, the signet ring, shoes, kill the cow to celebrate the return of the son. Best robe in the house was whose robe? It was the father's robe. The best robe of the house was the father's robe. You see, when we turn to God, when we finally turn around and come home, he covers our broken, stained lives with his righteousness. The signet ring and the shoes represent the restoration of son's position and authority. The signet ring was a signature ring. You make business transaction. The father restores his identity and his place in the family. And servants were without shoes. Sons wore shoes. And the cow represented the celebration. The whole town is invited. Have you ever killed a cow? Have you ever killed a pig? You got to invite the whole town. They have no refrigerators back in those days. You gotta kill the whole thing. Invite everybody. Everybody's invited to come and celebrate the return of his son. So everyone's gonna find out that Father accepts him, that Father has restored him. And this is not the end of the story, but there is now the older brother's reaction. I think so often when we hear this message or Luke 15, we don't hear about the older brother, but Jesus is actually speaking to the older brother. Jesus is actually speaking to the Pharisees and the scribes. So verse 25, the older son was out in the field, and he is always out in the field. He's always where his father tells him to be. You know, I have a sister who's always done the right thing, who's always done well, went to good school, got a good job, never upset at my parents. So I could kind of imagine what it was like probably for this younger brother to live under that kind of sibling. So if you're an older sibling like that, be gracious to your younger siblings. But again, I think many, if not most of us in Christian faith that have been in the church can relate to the older son better. For the most part, we have not run off to the faraway country. We have tried to be faithful and obedient. And through this story, we'll soon realize that there are two types of sinners: law-breaking sinner and law-keeping sinner. Verses 27 to 28, the servant tells him the great news. Your brother who was dead has come back alive, and your father has killed the calf to celebrate and invite everybody. But instead of being glad, the text tells us the older son gets angry and he refuses to go in. Dr. Bailey states, in Middle Eastern culture, all family members were required to be present when there is celebration of this magnitude. By refusing to go in, the older son is bringing shame to his father's reputation. I mean, those that grew up in Korean homes or Asian homes, whenever my parents had guests, I was forced to wear clothes that I never wore. I was forced to smile, and they'll tell me to dance and sing, and I'd be like, what? And I still had to do it. You know, we had to be part of this, right? And especially in their culture, the older son's job was to go around and make sure people were having a good time, make sure people had enough wine and food. He was supposed to be the second host to the father. But to make the matters worse, the son disagrees with the father in front of the whole village. See, by refusing to go in, the older son has publicly disagreed with his father and publicly shamed his father's reputation. See, growing up, even if I had a problem with my parents, even if I had a problem them making me dance in front of my guest, I will never say anything in front of the guest. I mean, that would be the big trouble. If I was like, Dad, I don't want to dance. You'd be like, what? It's time to get in big trouble, right? I would always wait for everyone to go home and then would address my parents. But here, this guy straight up just brings shame onto his father's name in front of everybody. How does the father respond to his older son's defiant act? Verse 28, part B. The father goes out and he pleads with him. See, everyone hearing this story expects the father to fire back at the older son for publicly shaming his name. Fine. You don't want to come in? Then get out of the house and don't come back. But the father, hearing that his older son is upset, goes out immediately to plead with his son. See, we think Jesus is really upset at the Pharisees in our passage today. What you realize is Jesus is not just angry at the Pharisees and their disregard for the sinners and the tax collectors, but Jesus is actually, through telling these three stories, he's pleading with the religious leaders. Right? He's going out and showing them, hey, you guys should come and join us. Right? See life from my perspective. See others from my perspective. The father desires his son to see things the way he sees them. He wanted his older son to love and forgive his brother. This is what Jesus desired from the religious leaders, but also this is what Jesus desires from us, to see others from his perspective. to love people despite their shortcomings, to be patient and show enduring love, to welcome people that may be different from us. And church, to be very, very honest, my church and many churches in the city, we're not very good at this. We invite people that are very similar to us. We invite people that are already churched. But as a church plan, here in Itaewon, middle of Itaewon, in this amazing hotel, I think you have an opportunity to reach people that may never step into an already existing church. I love Gospel City. I love this place and this church plant and the location you're in, because I know that this could be a place where broken, lost, disoriented people can come and receive Jesus. But it's going to take all of us to be able to do that. To love those that may be different. To love those that may have different theological disposition. To love those that may see life differently. And no better place than Itaewon here. Verses 29 and 30, I'm almost done. The older son becomes more upset. Right? Father comes out and pleads with him, but the older son becomes even more upset. And he says this, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you, never disobeyed your orders." Any fathers here? Raise your hand if you're a father. Imagine your son coming to you one day and saying, "Look," without addressing you as a father, "Look, all these years I have been slaving for you, never disobeyed any of your commands." How weird is that? I mean, he has daddy issues for sure. If he thinks that's a right conversation with his dad, there's an issue here. There's so much we can glean from what he's saying. And he says, "Yet you never gave me even a young goat to celebrate with friends. But this son of yours, not my brother, this son of yours has squandered your property with prostitutes and comes home. You killed a fattened calf for him." You see, he refuses to call his father, but begins his protest by saying, "Look, I did that, my father would poke my eyes out." Then he says, "All these years I have been slaving for you," right? A slave, not a son. We see that the older son clearly has a distorted view of his father, which led him to have a distorted view of himself. Right? "I have never disobeyed all your commands, but you didn't even give me a goat." Here's the heart of the issue. The older son believes that his father is not loving, not generous, not gracious. This had made him become harsh, not only towards himself, but towards his own brother. See, the father we see in Luke 15 couldn't be any more different. In Luke 15, this father is a father who lavishly loves. This father forgives. This father runs after us. This father celebrates our return. This father comes out to dialogue with us, even when we disagree. And verse 31, the father responds. And he says, "My son, my child, everything I have is yours." What a gracious response to a son who refuses to call him father, who refers to his own brother as "son of yours." The father still acknowledges his son. If you look at the Greek word here, "my child," for my son, it is a very tender and affectionate word. It's almost saying, "my precious child, my precious child." It is more tender and affectionate than the word the father used of his younger son. You see that? When father says in verse 31, "My son, my son, my child," father is reminding him of who he is to him. So "you are my precious child." It's more affectionate than the words that he used for even the younger son. And he says this, everything I have is yours. He reminds his older son who he is and what he has been given. You see, the younger son already received his part of the family estate. Now, everything that the father owns is what? Is the older son's. That's just the truth. Yet the older son is still stuck on a small goat. The older son is still complaining about, you did not even give me a goat. When father has already given him everything. And every house, every goat, every cow that he owns is actually now his. But if we're honest, don't we do this ourselves? Jesus gave his life for us. We have the victory in him. He invites us to be his son and daughters, to live victorious lives. Yet how many times this week have we questioned God's love for us? Too often we are stuck on goats when we have been given greater things. Too often as Christians, we are stuck on goats when God has already given us everything. Remember the younger son's speech when he came back to the father? I have sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be your son. And part 3, hire me as a worker so I can pay back my debt. The older son has been living in the third request all his life. He thought, as long as I do well, follow all the rules, then maybe my father will finally love me. Maybe finally he'll give me a goat. Friends, this is why we need to be reminded of the gospel every day. The gospel says God's love for us has nothing to do with what we bring to the table. He loved us when we were sinners. But you see, these religious leaders and some of us sitting here today, we have a hard time understanding that. And this made these religious leaders and us demand not only things from ourselves, but things from others. So verse 32, the father pleads with the older son, won't you come in and celebrate, for your brother was once dead, but is alive, was lost, and now found. See, this is Jesus' plea to the religious leaders. Come in and eat with us, for they have been dead, but they are alive now. You see, all 3 stories in Luke 15, something precious is lost and someone goes after to look for them. The shepherd loses sheep and goes after them. The woman loses a coin, goes after the coin, looks ever for the coin. And everything points to the son goes away and is lost, someone going to look for the brother. But again, this older brother was the one who was supposed to go and look for and find his younger brother. He refused to do so. But you and I, we have an awesome older brother in Jesus. We were once dead, unwilling and unable to turn to God. So Jesus, seeing our predicament, leaves his wonderful home to come to the world that he created. He knew a payment needed to be made because of what we have done. He lived a perfect life without sin and died the death that we deserved. He was mocked, shamed, and humiliated for us. And by his blood, we have been pronounced clean. And through his death and resurrection, we are now invited to be the sons and daughters of living God. So all the younger brothers and sisters who have gone away to faraway country, you who have broken the law, won't you come home? You can freely come, for it does not matter what you have done, what you have not done. Doesn't matter how you have lived, what choices you have made. It is safe to come home. God is not asking you to pay up. You don't need to measure up. You simply need to turn around and come home. God is waiting and he will run to embrace you. Older brothers and sisters, you who have been in the Father's field many years, you who have been around the Father's house for many years, you who have never broken any laws, won't you come in? The Father is pleading, won't you let me love you? I love you not because you have kept all the laws, but simply because you are my child. And I'm not sure what kind of earthly father that you have. But I hope we could rejoice. I hope we are encouraged this morning to know that we have the best Father in heaven. Amen. Let's pray.